To millions of wrestling fans around the world, he was known as the Lariat, a tobacco-chewing, bull-rope-swinging cowboy from the plains of Texas who looked like he'd just walked out of a barroom brawl and was looking for another one. Stan Hansen didn't just wrestle his opponents, he destroyed them. He left a trail of broken bodies and shattered careers everywhere he went. And the scariest part? Most of it wasn't an act. Hansen was notorious for being one of the stiffest workers in professional wrestling history. His punches landed, his lariats connected, his body slams rattled bones. While other wrestlers pulled their shots and protected their opponents, Hansen operated on a completely different wavelength. When you stepped into the ring with Stan Hansen, you knew you were going to take some real punishment. The only question was, how much? In this video, we count down the top 5 times Stan Hansen snapped. Real-life moments when the unsinkable battleship crossed the line from professional wrestling into something far more dangerous. Moments that left champions with broken necks. Moments that sent eyeballs popping out of skulls. Moments that saw championship belts destroyed and entire promotions left scrambling. And by the time we reach number 1, you'll understand why this soft-spoken Texas gentleman became the most feared foreign wrestler in Japanese history. But before we get to that, you need to understand something crucial about Stan Hansen. Something that explains everything about his legendarily brutal style. John Stanley Hansen II was born on August 29, 1949 in Knox City, Texas. A small town in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place that breeds tough men. Hansen grew up working hard, playing harder, and developing the kind of no-nonsense attitude that would define his entire career. After high school, Hansen attended West Texas State University, where he played football for the Buffaloes. This is where things get interesting, because West Texas State in the early 1970s was essentially a wrestling factory. The football program produced an absurd number of future professional wrestlers, including a young man named Frank Goodish, who would later become famous under the name Bruiser Brody. Hansen and Brody met on that football field, forged a friendship that would last decades, and would eventually become one of the most dominant tag teams in Japanese wrestling history. When Hansen's football dreams didn't pan out, when he tried out for the Detroit Wheels of the World Football League and didn't make the team, he turned to professional wrestling. The Funk family brought him into the business through their Amarillo territory, and Hansen took to it immediately. He was big, he was mean, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make it. But there was a problem that would define Hansen's entire career and make him one of the most dangerous men to ever lace up a pair of boots. Stan Hansen had terrible eyesight. We're not talking about needing reading glasses. We're talking about severe myopia. Without his glasses, the world was a blur of shapes and shadows. And in the wrestling ring, where split-second timing and precise distance calculation are crucial, that kind of vision impairment could be catastrophic. The obvious solution would be contact lenses. But Hansen refused to wear them. Some say it was stubbornness. Some say they irritated his eyes. Some say he just didn't trust them to stay in place during a match. Whatever the reason, Hansen stepped into the ring essentially blind. This created a dilemma. In professional wrestling, you're supposed to make your moves look devastating without actually hurting your opponent. You pull your punches, you control your slams, you protect the person you're working with. But how do you do that when you can't accurately judge distances? When you can't see exactly where your opponent's head is when you throw that lariat? Hansen's solution was simple and brutal. If he couldn't judge the distance precisely enough to pull his shot safely, he would just swing with full force. Every time. That way, he'd make contact. The move would look real. The business would be protected. The only downside was that his opponents would take legitimate punishment. And that's exactly what happened. For nearly 3 decades, Stan Hansen hit people for real. Not because he wanted to hurt them. Not because he was malicious. Simply because he literally couldn't see well enough to do it any other way. The result was a wrestling style so stiff, so legitimately dangerous, that it became legendary. Wrestlers who worked with Hansen knew what they were getting into. They went just as hard right back, because that was the only way to survive. Hansen matches weren't fake in the way most wrestling matches are fake. They existed in this strange middle ground between worked entertainment and legitimate combat. and the bodies Hansen left in his wake proved it. So with that understanding in mind, let's start with number 5, and a moment that would establish Hansen as a man who simply couldn't be controlled. Number 5. The AWA Championship hijacking. Professional wrestling has always operated on a simple premise. The promoter tells you what to do, and you do it. If you're told to win, you win. If you're told to lose, you lose. The belt doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the company. And when the company wants it back, you give it back without complaint. Stan Hansen apparently didn't get that memo. In 1985, Hansen captured the AWA World Heavyweight Championship from Rick Martel. The American Wrestling Association, run by legendary promoter Vern Gagne, was one of the last major territories still competing against Vince McMahon's expanding World Wrestling Federation empire. Getting the world title on Hansen was a significant move designed to capitalize on his popularity in Japan and create crossover interest. There was just one problem. The AWA didn't actually do anything with Hansen as champion. According to Hansen himself, the promotion treated his title reign as an afterthought. He was given squash matches on television against nobodies. There was no real promotion of him as champion. No significant storylines. No money-drawing feuds. Just week after week of meaningless matches while his frustration grew. Meanwhile, over in Japan, All Japan Pro Wrestling promoter Giant Baba was booking Hansen as a main event attraction. Baba had lined up challengers for Hansen's AWA title. Big matches, big money. Real opportunities to draw and earn what a world champion should earn. And then, in June of 1986, Vern Gagne dropped the bomb. Hansen was ordered to drop the AWA title to Nick Bockwinkel in Denver, Colorado. Just like that, end of his reign. No build-up, no payoff. Just a directive to lose the belt. Hansen called Giant Baba in Japan to ask what he should do. Baba had already advertised Hansen as AWA champion for the upcoming tour. Baba told Hansen not to drop the title. So Hansen didn't. On June 29, 1986, Stan Hansen no-showed the title defense in Denver. He simply didn't appear. Reports suggest he was actually in the building that night, but he refused to go out and lose. He walked out of the arena with the AWA World Heavyweight Championship belt still in his possession. The AWA was thrown into chaos. They had to strip Hansen of the title and award it to Bockwinkel by default. But there was a problem. Bockwinkel didn't have a belt. Hansen had the belt, and Hansen wasn't giving it back. Hansen flew to Japan with the championship and continued defending it in All Japan Pro Wrestling as if nothing had happened. Over there, he was still the AWA World Heavyweight Champion. He had the physical belt to prove it. Meanwhile, back in America, the AWA had to create a replacement belt using one of their tag team championship belts and rebranding it as the world title. Eventually, the AWA threatened legal action. They wanted their property back. Hansen agreed to return the belt. But he had one final act of defiance left in him. According to legend, before mailing the belt back to Vern Gagne, Hansen took it out to his property in Texas. He threw it on the ground, and then he got in his pickup truck and drove over it. Multiple times. Back and forth, grinding the championship belt into the dirt, leaving tire tracks and mud all over the golden leather. Then he mailed it back. The AWA received a championship belt that looked like it had been through a war, which in a sense it had. Hansen later expressed some regret about how he handled the situation, but the message had been sent. Nobody told Stan Hansen what to do, not even the promoters. The incident essentially blackballed Hansen from American wrestling for 6 years. But that was fine with him. He made his real money in Japan anyway. And over there, his reputation only grew stronger after the AWA incident. Here was a man who would defy anyone, destroy anything, if he felt he was being treated unfairly. That kind of attitude resonated deeply with the Japanese audience. But refusing to drop a title is one thing. What's coming up at number 4 involves much more direct physical consequences. Number 4. The Brutal Brawl with Andre the Giant. September 23, 1981. New Japan Pro Wrestling. The Bloody Fight Series Tour. A match that would become legendary not for its technical excellence, but for its sheer unbridled chaos. Stan Hansen versus Andre the Giant. Now, Andre the Giant needs no introduction. The eighth wonder of the world. The biggest star in professional wrestling. A man who stood 7 feet tall and weighed over 500 pounds. A man who almost never lost. A man who commanded respect from everyone in the business simply by existing. And Stan Hansen? Stan Hansen didn't care. He didn't care how big you were. He didn't care how famous you were. He didn't care what the protocol was. When that bell rang, Hansen came at you with everything he had. The match in question was designed to establish Hansen as a top-tier threat in Japan. By going toe-to-toe with Andre and surviving, Hansen would cement his reputation as a legitimate monster. The problem was that both men had the same approach to professional wrestling. Hit hard, hit for real, don't hold back. From the opening bell, it was clear this wasn't going to be a normal match. Andre booted Hansen in the chest before the Texan even fully entered the ring. Hansen responded by charging right back. What followed was less a professional wrestling match and more a bar fight between two giants. They brawled in the ring. They brawled outside the ring. They threw forearms and elbows with enough force that you could hear the impact throughout the arena. Andre worked over Hansen's arm with genuine malice, trying to negate the devastating lariat. Hansen responded by targeting Andre's massive legs, trying to chop the giant down. The match had to be restarted after a double countout because neither man would stop fighting outside the ring. The crowd in Japan went absolutely insane. They had never seen anyone attack Andre the Giant like this. They had never seen Andre so aggressive, so willing to engage in a straight-up brawl. At one point, Andre grabbed an elbow pad from under the ring. Whether it was loaded or not has been the subject of debate for decades. What isn't debatable is that Andre used it to lay into Hansen with renewed fury. Hansen, never one to back down, responded in kind. The match eventually ended in chaos, with New Japan officials having to physically separate the two men as they continued throwing punches and elbows. The aftermath was significant. Hansen was immediately elevated to the top of the card in Japan. He had stood toe-to-toe with the biggest man in wrestling and hadn't backed down for a second. Andre reportedly respected Hansen tremendously after their encounters, which is not something the Giant gave freely. But more importantly, the match demonstrated something that would define Hansen's entire Japanese career. He wasn't there to work safe, cooperative matches where everyone went home healthy. He was there to fight. And if his opponent wasn't prepared to fight back just as hard, that was their problem. The brawl with Andre established a template that Hansen would follow for the next 2 decades. No matter who you were, no matter how big or how famous, if you stepped into the ring with Stan Hansen, you were in for a war. Some men could handle it, others were destroyed by it. Speaking of destruction, that brings us to number 3 on our list, a moment so violent, so graphic, that it became one of the most infamous injuries in wrestling history. Number 3. The night he popped Vader's eye out. February 10th, 1990, the Tokyo Dome, New Japan Pro Wrestling Super Fight event. 60,000 screaming fans packed into Japan's most prestigious venue for an interpromotional dream match. IWGP Heavyweight Champion Big Van Vader representing New Japan. All Japan Triple Crown Champion Stan Hansen representing the rival promotion. 2 of the biggest, baddest American wrestlers in Japan about to collide. What happened next would become wrestling legend. Big Van Vader was a monster in his own right. A former NFL offensive lineman who stood 6'5" and weighed over 400 pounds. He wore a massive helmet that covered his entire face, breathing steam like some kind of mechanical demon. In his prime, Vader was considered one of the most physically dominant wrestlers on the planet. Stan Hansen was everything Vader was and more. At this point, Hansen had been the top foreign wrestler in Japan for nearly a decade. His lariat was so feared that Japanese commentators would scream its name whenever he connected. He was violent, he was unpredictable, and he was about to prove exactly why. The trouble started before the match even began. As Vader was getting into the ring, Hansen swung his trademark bull rope. The rope had a cowbell attached to the end. Whether Hansen was trying to intimidate Vader, or whether his terrible eyesight caused him to misjudge the distance, the cowbell caught Vader directly in the face. The impact shattered Vader's nose instantly. Blood began pouring from the wound. Through his helmet, Vader could barely see, his ears were ringing, and the match hadn't even officially started yet. Vader was furious. When he finally recovered enough to engage with Hansen, he did so with legitimate anger. He walked up to Hansen and threw a massive right hand directly to the ear. No pulling the punch, no protecting his opponent. Just a full-force shot designed to hurt. And that's when the fight truly began. What followed was one of the stiffest, most violent matches in professional wrestling history. Hansen and Vader abandoned any pretense of working together. They were legitimately trying to hurt each other. Punches were thrown with full force. Lariats connected flush. Bodies were slammed into the canvas with no regard for safety. Somewhere in this chaos, Hansen's thumb found Vader's eye socket. Again, it's impossible to know if this was intentional or another byproduct of Hansen's terrible eyesight. What we do know is the result. Hansen's thumb drove into Vader's face, and Vader's right eyeball popped partially out of its socket. This actually happened. In front of 60,000 fans and countless more watching on television, Big Van Vader's eye was hanging out of his head. Vader later described the moment with remarkable clarity. He turned his back to the crowd, reached up, and felt his eyeball sitting on his cheek. Using his thumb, he pushed the eye back into the socket. Then, with the swelling from the broken nose helping to hold the eye in place, he turned around and continued wrestling. Let that sink in. Vader pushed his own eyeball back into his skull and kept fighting for another 10 to 15 minutes. The match eventually ended in a double countout as both men brawled into the crowd and refused to return to the ring. It was probably the right call. At that point, someone needed to intervene before one of them killed the other. The aftermath was severe. Vader required a metal plate to be surgically placed under his eye. His nose had to be completely rebuilt. He missed significant time recovering from injuries that were supposed to happen in a fake fight. But both men would later speak about the match with a strange kind of respect. They had gone to war together. They had pushed each other to the absolute limit. In the violent world of Japanese wrestling that earned you something that money couldn't buy. Jim Ross, who would later work with both men, saw the footage and was convinced wrestling must be real in Japan. Nobody could fake that kind of violence. The tape of Hansen versus Vader became legendary, passed around among wrestling fans as evidence of what happened when two legitimate tough guys decided to throw the rulebook out the window. Hansen himself acknowledged causing the injury but framed it as an accident resulting from their intense style. They beat the hell out of each other, he admitted. That night was just a little more extreme than usual. A little more extreme. Hansen knocked a man's eye out of his skull, and his assessment was that things got a little more extreme than usual. That tells you everything you need to know about what a Stan Hansen match was actually like. But as brutal as the Vader incident was, it wasn't the most significant injury Hansen ever caused. That distinction belongs to number 2 on our list. An injury that happened at Madison Square Garden. An injury that nearly ended a legend's career. An injury that, ironically, made Stan Hansen a superstar. Number 2. Breaking Bruno Sammartino's neck. April 26, 1976. Madison Square Garden. The most famous arena in the world. The main event featured a title defense by the man who was the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. Bruno Sammartino. Bruno needs some context for younger fans who might not know his name. In the 1970s, Bruno Sammartino wasn't just a wrestler. He was a cultural icon, the Italian Superman, the living legend. He had held the Worldwide Wrestling Federation Championship for nearly 8 years in his first reign, drawing sellout crowds to Madison Square Garden month after month. His popularity in the northeastern United States was unmatched by anyone in professional wrestling history. And his challenger that night was a young, relatively unknown Texan named Stan Hansen. Hansen had only been in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation for about 2 months. He was green by main event standards. But Vince McMahon Sr. saw potential in the Wild Cowboy, so he was thrust into a program with the promotion's biggest star. The storyline was simple. Hansen was a dangerous brawler who wanted to take Sammartino's title by any means necessary. What happened that night was not part of any storyline. About 15 minutes into the match, Hansen attempted a scoop power slam on Sammartino. It was a move he'd done countless times before. But something went wrong. The most common explanation involves sweat. Sammartino was wet from exertion. Hansen's grip slipped. Or maybe it was Hansen's terrible eyesight causing him to misjudge the position. Or maybe Sammartino wasn't expecting the move at that particular moment and stiffened up, throwing Hansen off balance. Whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic. Instead of rotating properly and landing on his back, Sammartino came down on the back of his head and neck. The impact was immediate and sickening. Hansen, still in the match, went behind Sammartino, got him in a headlock, and whispered to ask if he was okay. Sammartino couldn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, he asked for a few seconds to collect himself. Those few seconds stretched into an eternity. Sammartino lay on the canvas, unable to feel his limbs properly. He described a sensation of extreme heat followed by numbness. In his head, he was terrified that he'd been paralyzed. Hansen, following the old-school code of never breaking character no matter what, continued attacking Sammartino. He kicked him. He stomped him. The champion struggled to his feet using the ring ropes, his body operating on pure instinct while his mind raced with fear. The match continued for a short while longer until Hansen struck Sammartino in the head, opening a cut that bled profusely. The referee, seeing the amount of blood, called for the bell. Hansen was declared the winner by referee stoppage, but the title didn't change hands due to the nature of the finish. Backstage, the truth emerged. Bruno Sammartino had broken his neck. Doctors confirmed a fracture to his 6th vertebra. They informed Sammartino that the break was millimeters away from his spinal cord. If the damage had been even slightly worse, he would have been paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of his life. The only reason he escaped complete catastrophe was the musculature of his neck, built up over years of weightlifting. Sammartino was hospitalized and placed in traction. His family was terrified. His parents, who were in their 80s, had to be carefully informed of the injury. Bruno was genuinely afraid that the news would give them heart attacks. The Worldwide Wrestling Federation now had a massive problem. Their biggest star was out indefinitely with a broken neck, and the cause was a botched wrestling move. That wasn't good for business. So they did what wrestling promoters always do. They turned it into a storyline. The official story became that Hansen's devastating lariat, not a botched power slam, had broken Sammartino's neck. Wrestling journalist Bill Apter published articles claiming that Hansen had loaded his elbow pad before striking Bruno. The incident was reframed as evidence of Hansen's terrifying power rather than a tragic accident. This reframing had significant consequences. In America, Hansen became a hated villain. Fans threw debris at him. He received death threats. Police had to escort him from buildings. The emotional response was so intense that Vince McMahon Sr. temporarily sent Hansen to Japan to let things cool down. But in Japan, the narrative worked in Hansen's favor. The news that Hansen had broken the great Bruno Sammartino's neck arrived before Hansen did. Japanese fans who revered Sammartino from his many tours of their country were stunned. This American cowboy had taken out one of the biggest stars in wrestling history. He must be incredibly dangerous. When Hansen arrived in Japan, he was immediately treated as a major attraction. The broken neck incident had made him a star overseas almost overnight. His entire legendary Japanese career, all those championships, all those main events, all that fame and fortune, can be traced back to that terrible accident at Madison Square Garden. Sammartino eventually returned and got his revenge, defeating Hansen at Showdown at Shea in front of 32,000 fans. But the damage, both physical and professional, had been done. Hansen would never work for the McMahons again. He was essentially exiled from the biggest promotion in America. Not that it mattered. Japan embraced Hansen as their favorite monster, and he spent the next 2 decades terrorizing their rings instead. The man who broke Bruno Sammartino's neck became the most successful foreign wrestler in Japanese history. Sometimes a tragedy opens doors you never expected. But now we've arrived at number 1. The moment that truly defines Stan Hansen's legacy of legitimate violence. A confrontation that demonstrates not just his willingness to hurt opponents, but his complete inability to work any other way. Number 1. The Danny Crawit shoot-hold. This incident represents something different from the others on our list. It's not a famous match. It's not a well-documented injury. It's a story passed down through the wrestling community, told by the men who were there, about the moment when someone finally gave Stan Hansen a taste of his own medicine. Tom Zenk, a journeyman wrestler who worked for multiple promotions throughout the 1980s and 1990s, told this story on his website before his death in 2017. It's a story about the long tours of Japan, where wrestlers would spend weeks on buses traveling from city to city, working match after match with the same opponents. According to Zenk, those tours could be brutal. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. You were stuck with the same people, night after night. Tensions would build. And if you were working with someone who consistently hit too hard, who consistently hurt you, that tension could become unbearable. Stan Hansen was known for being one of those guys. His poor eyesight, his commitment to working stiff, his refusal to moderate his style even when opponents complained. All of it added up to create a situation where the other wrestlers on the tour were getting legitimately beaten up night after night. The boys were sick of it. Every match with Hansen meant taking real punishment, real bruises, real pain, and there was nothing they could do about it because Hansen was a top star, protected by the promotion, and apparently incapable of working any lighter. Enter Danny Crawit. Crawit was a Canadian wrestler who had legitimate technical skills. He knew how to work, how to protect his opponents, how to make things look good without actually hurting anyone. He was the opposite of Hansen in almost every way, and apparently, he'd had enough. During a tour of Japan, Crawit got Hansen in a legitimate armbar, a shoot-hold, not a worked wrestling move where you pretend to apply pressure. A real submission hold designed to control and, if necessary, injure your opponent. And he cranked on it. Hansen, for perhaps the first time in his career, found himself in a position where he wasn't in control. Crawit had him locked down, applying pressure to the arm, and Hansen couldn't escape. The man who had hurt so many people who had worked so stiff for so long was helpless. According to Zenk's account, Hansen started screaming, profanities, protests, begging Crawit to stop. His exact words, as relayed by Zenk, were a desperate plea that his arm didn't bend that way. Crawit eventually released the hold. The point had been made. Even Stan Hansen, the toughest man in wrestling, had his limits. Even the man who had broken necks and popped out eyeballs could be humbled if someone had the skill and the guts to put him in a real hold. The wrestlers who heard about this incident reportedly celebrated. Finally, someone had shown Hansen what it felt like to be on the receiving end of legitimate punishment. Finally, the stiffest worker in the business had been taught that there were consequences for hurting people. What makes this story number 1 on our list isn't the severity of the incident. Nobody's neck was broken. Nobody's eye popped out. It's the significance. For decades, Stan Hansen had operated as if the normal rules didn't apply to him. He hit hard because he couldn't see well enough to hit light. He hurt people because that's just how he worked. And nobody could do anything about it because he was a star. Danny Crawit proved that someone could do something about it. That even legends have vulnerabilities. That no matter how tough you think you are, there's always someone out there who can humble you if you push them far enough. Hansen continued wrestling for years after this incident. He continued working stiff. He continued hurting people. That was simply who he was. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that the boys weren't as helpless as they seemed. That if he pushed too hard, someone might push back even harder. What becomes clear when you look at these incidents together is that Stan Hansen wasn't playing a character. The wild, violent cowboy who didn't care about the rules, who would hurt anyone who got in his way, who couldn't be controlled by promoters or opponents, that wasn't an act. That was Stan Hansen. His poor eyesight forced him to work a style that most wrestlers couldn't survive. His stubbornness made him refuse to adapt. And his sheer physical ability made him too valuable to fire, no matter how many people he hurt along the way. The combination created one of the most unique performers in wrestling history. a man who existed in the gray area between work and shoot, between entertainment and combat. There's a famous story about Hansen's lariat. Japanese commentators would scream the word whenever he connected, making it one of the most over-finishing moves in the country's history. But the lariat wasn't just a wrestling move for Hansen. It was a legitimate weapon. He would run at his opponent, swing his arm with full force, and club them in the head or neck with enough power to knock out a horse. The story goes that Hansen worked that way because he couldn't afford to miss. If he pulled his punch and whiffed, everyone would see that wrestling was fake. So he swung hard, connected flush, and let his opponents deal with the consequences. Some could handle it, some couldn't. But everyone who worked with Hansen knew they were in for a fight. That philosophy extended to everything Hansen did in the ring. He couldn't see well enough to work safe, so he worked dangerous. He couldn't cooperate smoothly, so he brawled. He couldn't pull his shots, so he threw them full force. And somehow, over 30 years of professional wrestling, he never seriously hurt anyone through malice. Every injury he caused was technically an accident, a byproduct of his style rather than intentional violence. That might be the strangest thing about Stan Hansen's legacy. For all the damage he did, for all the necks he broke and eyes he popped out, and wrestlers he battered night after night, nobody who worked with him has ever accused him of being malicious. Dangerous, yes. Stiff, absolutely. But not mean. Not cruel. Just a man with terrible eyesight who did what he had to do to make his style work. Hansen retired in 2001 after a career that spanned nearly 3 decades. He had become one of the most successful foreign wrestlers in Japanese history, holding championships in multiple promotions, main eventing shows in front of tens of thousands of fans, and earning more money than most American wrestlers could dream of. In 2016, he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. Big Van Vader, the man whose eye Hansen had knocked out of its socket 26 years earlier, inducted him. If that's not proof that there were no hard feelings in the wrestling business, nothing is. Today, Hansen lives quietly in Texas. He makes occasional appearances at wrestling conventions and reunions. He's soft-spoken and polite, nothing like the wild man he portrayed on television. The tobacco-chewing, bull-rope-swinging psychopath was always just a character. But the injuries were real, the violence was real. The fear that other wrestlers felt when they saw his name on the schedule, that was very, very real. And when old-timers talk about what wrestling used to be, about the days when matches actually hurt and champions were legitimate tough guys who could defend their titles for real if necessary, they always mention Stan Hansen, the cowboy who couldn't see straight but could hit harder than anyone in the business. And now you know why. But before we go, there's one more aspect of Stan Hansen's legacy that deserves mention. Something that puts all this violence into perspective. Despite being responsible for some of the most brutal moments in wrestling history, Stan Hansen was universally respected by his peers. Not feared in the way that makes people avoid you. Respected in the way that makes people want to work with you, even knowing the risks. Bruno Sammartino, the man whose neck Hansen broke, never held a grudge. He understood that it was an accident, a byproduct of the business they had both chosen. When Hansen was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, there was no controversy about his inclusion. The wrestling community agreed that he had earned his place among the legends. Big Van Vader, who lost significant vision in one eye because of Hansen, inducted him into that Hall of Fame. Standing at the podium, Vader spoke about Hansen with genuine affection and admiration. These weren't enemies forced to reconcile. These were brothers in arms who had gone to war together and come out respecting each other more. That's the thing about professional wrestling in Hansen's era. It was violent. It was dangerous. People got hurt, sometimes seriously. But there was an understanding among the performers. They were all in it together. They were all risking their bodies every night for the entertainment of the fans. And if someone got hurt, as long as it wasn't malicious, you moved on. You didn't hold grudges. You understood that the person who hurt you was taking the same risks you were. Hansen embodied that philosophy completely. He hurt people, yes, but he also got hurt. He took punishment just as severe as anything he dished out. Every night, he stepped into that ring knowing that his opponents would be swinging just as hard as he was, and he accepted that. He welcomed it, because that's what wrestling was supposed to be. The modern wrestling business is safer. Performers work lighter styles designed to protect each other. Medical protocols have improved dramatically. Injuries still happen, but the kind of routine violence that Hansen represented is largely a thing of the past. Some would say that's progress. Others would say something has been lost. The matches don't feel as real anymore. The danger doesn't seem as present. When you watch Stan Hansen work, you can feel the impact of every blow. You know you're watching something that could go wrong at any moment. That tension, that uncertainty, that sense of barely controlled chaos, that's what made Hansen's matches special. JBL, who modeled his entire wrestling style after Hansen, complete with the lariat finisher and the Texas cowboy persona, has spoken extensively about what made the original so compelling. Hansen didn't look like he was performing. He looked like he was fighting. Every match felt like it could spiral out of control, and sometimes it did. That unpredictability is impossible to replicate in the modern era of corporate wrestling. Everything is choreographed. Everything is planned. Safety meetings happen before matches. Medical staff stand ready at ringside. The wildness has been tamed. But in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, when Hansen was at his peak, none of that existed. Wrestlers were expected to take care of themselves. If you couldn't handle the punishment, you didn't belong in the ring. And Hansen was the ultimate test of whether someone belonged. Jim Cornette, the legendary wrestling manager and commentator, once made a statement about Hansen that perfectly captures his essence. Cornette said that Hansen's lariat was so vicious that it convinced him wrestling must be real in Japan. Because nobody could fake that kind of impact. Nobody could pretend to hit someone that hard. That was Hansen's gift. He made everything feel real because, for him, it was real. His poor eyesight forced him to bridge the gap between performance and combat. And in doing so, he created a style that was more compelling, more visceral, more memorable than almost anything else in wrestling history. His influence extends far beyond his own career. The entire strong style movement in Japanese wrestling, which emphasizes hard-hitting, realistic action, owes a debt to Hansen and his contemporaries. Wrestlers like Kenta Kobashi, Mitsuharu Misawa, and Toshiaki Kawada, who would become legends in their own right, grew up watching Hansen and learning that wrestling was supposed to hurt. Even in American wrestling, Hansen's influence persists. Every time you see a wrestler throw a legitimate-looking lariat, every time you hear a commentator sell the impact of a big move by comparing it to getting hit by a truck, you're seeing Hansen's shadow. He changed what professional wrestling could be. He proved that audiences responded to violence that felt real. And he paid the price for that proof with his body, absorbing just as much punishment as he delivered over nearly 3 decades in the ring. When Hansen retired in 2000, he walked away on his own terms. No career-ending injury forced him out. No scandal drove him from the business. He simply decided, at age 51, that he had given enough. That his body had taken enough punishment. That it was time to go home to Texas and enjoy the fruits of his labor. Few wrestlers get to make that choice. Most are forced out by injury, by declining relevance, by the cruel march of time. Hansen beat all of those things. He survived every match, every brawl, every stiff shot, and walked away with his health and his legacy intact. That might be the most impressive thing about Stan Hansen. Not the championships, not the legendary matches, not the famous incidents of violence, but the simple fact that he survived a career that should have killed him, that he took and dealt more punishment than almost anyone in wrestling history and lived to tell the story. They don't make them like Stan Hansen anymore. The business won't allow it. The liability is too high. The risk is too great. Modern wrestling is entertainment first and combat a distant second. But for those who were there, for those who witnessed Hansen in his prime, for those who felt the impact of his lariat or watched in awe as he destroyed everyone in his path, the memory remains vivid. Tell us in the comments about your favorite Stan Hansen moments. Like and subscribe for 100 years of luck. Until next time.